Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here today and inviting me and listening to me talk as a fellow humanities PhD about the entrepreneurial career path, specifically about building a brand and parlaying that brand into a profitable business that supports you financially. So a lot of what I'm going to say is sort of story-oriented, but I try to draw out what I learned along the way. I apologize to be speaking from notes. I just had surgery a couple days ago, so my brain is not completely back yet. But we have the Q&A for you to have me clarify anything. First, I want to start by defining the terms brand and business, because I think that having definitions of these terms makes them more manageable to think about. Like, both concepts might be a little unfamiliar and uncomfortable. They were for me before I went this route in my life. So when I say brand, what I really mean is a distinct identity as communicated through words and images. So think, for example, of the Apple logo, how it captures the essence of the Apple brand. It's clean and pure and futuristic, and yet it has this sort of organic and balanced quality that makes it feel almost natural or inevitable. It fits with how our Apple products are part of our bodies in a way, So there's something about the Apple brand that is communicated in that logo. Another example of a brand is your scholarly identity. Think of how your angle on research, your assumptions, and your arguments are all unlike anyone else's. So with each paper you've written and each talk that you've delivered, you have been steadily building your brand as a scholar. And that brand will be the starting point for the brand that you build as a business person, if you choose to go this route. So you're not starting from scratch, you're just revising the brand that you currently have. The second term I want to define is business. And when I say that, I'm referring to any organization, no matter how small, even if it's just you, that was designed to produce a profit. And you may have already run a business in your life by babysitting or mowing lawns or freelance editing or consulting or any number of things. And if so, you already know that the way a business thrives is by meeting its clients' needs and saving them time or money or both, all while generating enough revenue that the business is sustainable. So when you think of a business in these terms, it may make the whole idea of creating a business seem a little more doable, because really it's a matter of figuring out whose needs you can meet and making sure they can pay you to meet their needs. They're aware of their needs and they're willing to pay, and then you've got a business, or at least the beginnings of a solid business plan. So in a sense, just to summarize, anyone who works directly for clients or customers and takes direction from them and gets paid by them rather than from a boss who has created and defined the job is a business owner. And anyone who cultivates a clear and coherent sense of self and consciously communicates that self to others is a brand builder. So probably everyone in this room has some experience in both brand building and business running. So the question now is, how do you accomplish these on a larger scale in a systematic way such that you can actually create a viable business that will support you, that you can make a living from? So for the next few minutes, I'm going to share a little bit about how I build my business, and I'm going to weave in some practical tips that I learned from hard experience, because I didn't have this to go to when I was in grad school, although I wish I would have. I'm also going to show why my humanities PhD was the perfect preparation for what I do now, because I really do feel that I use every bit of my doctoral education every day. And then at the end, I'll be happy to address all of your questions in the Q&A. So, how I did it. Well, I grew up in a household that was financially supported by a small business. My dad is a landscape architect, so I saw him working hard, my whole childhood, to get hired by good clients, manage their expectations, sell his ideas, and make a somewhat consistent income. That last one was pretty tricky. So yeah, it can be challenging to live like this. So I grew up with a sense of the challenges of running a business, but I also saw the satisfaction that my dad felt in having clients bring him into their lives and solve their problems for them in a way that only he could, with his unique approach and expertise. And that always really appealed to me. By my 20s, as a humanities PhD student, however, I had a decidedly negative attitude toward business. I was your typical wannabe bohemian with a nose ring, and I looked down on anything that seemed corporate or profit-driven. But even then, I did joke about entrepreneurship as a solution to the higher ed jobs crisis. Whenever a friend was despondent about the job market, I'd be like, don't worry, when I start my multinational corporation, I'm going to hire you. So this memory tells me that even back then when I was wearing a nose ring and could only think of entrepreneurship as a joke, I was already beginning to sense that entrepreneurship might hold the solution to job scarcity. It just took me a while to take the option seriously as a career possibility for me. I finally did consider the option only after it became the only option that made any sense for me. During my academic job season, a lot of things happened in my life. I moved 1,000 miles away from grad school and my friends and support network. I defended my dissertation and I gave birth to my son. So that was all a lot to handle at once. And so while my friends were prepping job talks and flying off to interviews, I was sitting at home in yoga pants in an unfamiliar city with all of my books still packed away in moving boxes and a newborn attached to my boob at all times. And so during that period, we were just talking, it was this strange period of life. It's like forced introspection, you know, taking care of a baby all day with no adults to talk to. And I was, you know, just really, really searching, trying to figure out my next step. And all the advice I could get from anyone was very depressing. One of my professors suggested, why don't you try to get your foot in the door at a middle school by subbing? And I'm like, that sounds like a terrible fit for me. In other words, I pretty quickly realized I wasn't going to get answers from someone else. I had to figure them out for myself. During this period, I felt really severed from academia, and I felt isolated. Thankfully, that proved temporary, but during the time that it lasted, it was really crucial to the birth of my business because that sense of isolation freed me to think in a different direction than all my academic friends and colleagues. And this brings me to my first point about the transition to entrepreneurship, which is be prepared to go opposite, because you will probably seem weird, or you might, or maybe not, because there's a lot of you in this room. So hopefully it won't be for you the way it was for me. So the way that I actually started making money was by selling the skill that was easiest to sell, which is another point. You can start today if you start with the skill that's easy to sell, even if it's not the one you want to sell in the long term. And that is, I did light line editing and proofreading. And these just projects that came to me through word of mouth. I wasn't yet consciously cultivating a brand. I was just kind of trying to figure out what was out there and what I can do and listening for what people's needs were and things like that. Over time, I cultivated a set of services that I wanted to provide, and I developed my business, ScholarShape, to have this brand that meant something different from the typical editing service. My services are more comprehensive and customizable, obviously totally confidential, but most of my clients involve me in their writing process at multiple stages. So we can go through consultation, developmental editing, line editing. We can go through whatever set of services at whatever pace is ideal for the client. And I think that's pretty hard for people to find, so when people find me and that's what I offer, they're like, yes, you're the one I want to work with. So that's why it makes it my brand, because it distinguishes me from anyone else. And the work I do is what I really love to do. It's deeply intellectual. As I said before, it requires every bit of my doctoral training in research and reading and writing. Plus, it requires less tangible skills like empathy and adaptability. So it's been really satisfying and exciting for me to figure out work I can do that really does draw on everything that I've learned. But my point here is that you really can start today with your business, if you want to, by selling what people will buy from you today. And you can work your way towards selling what you really want to sell. And this is what brand development or brand revision is all about. So I recently wrote a blog post called How to Create Your Own Post-Act Job, which I can share the link with you all after if you're interested. But in the post, I share some key questions to help you get started with, conceptualizing what sort of business you would want to launch. You start with the question of what services you will offer or what needs you will meet. And then you think about, or concurrently you think about, who are the clients, who are the people with the need, and do they feel their need, or do you have to make them aware of their need? And do they have the money to pay you to meet the need? Hopefully, we would all love to reach a point where we can do pro bono work, and that's great. But when you're just getting started, obviously you have to pay the rent. So thinking about people who can pay you to meet their needs, even though it might sound crass and terrible. But once you've gone through, once you become me, you'll be like, well, that's life. Third question is, what's my unique value proposition? So what can you give that no one else can? And your doctoral education is going to be a huge part of that, because there are, even though we feel like they're all around us, there really aren't that many PhDs in the world. And so that's a really important piece of what makes you distinctive. Fourth question is, how will you communicate with potential clients? What style, like what tone of voice, what medium, what frequency? And this all gets to marketing, which is another word that might make you cringe, but once you learn more about it, it's really fun, and it's an interesting way to think about communication. And then the last question is, which resources do I need? And I'll talk more about that in a minute. There are so many free resources, you really shouldn't have to spend a dime starting your business for quite a while. Okay, so my third piece of advice is take advantage of all the free resources at your disposal. My favorite story to illustrate this is early in the process of conceptualizing my business, I took my infant son to story time at the library. And when story time was over, we're just kind of wandering around the library, and we found ourselves in the aisle of business books. And all the books that I would have like sneered at before, like, oh, I just like, this is intriguing. And I just pulled one after another off the shelf and like got totally absorbed. Ultimately, I like stuffed all the books I could in the cargo hold of my son's stroller and like checked out like 30 books on business. And then over the next few weeks, I just plowed through them. Like when he was nursing, I'd be like this, you know. So really, all that to say, pretty much most of my business knowledge comes from free library books. And the rest of it comes from free websites. So I've never taken a class in business. You're smart, and you will figure it out, is what I'm trying to say. So I would just suggest not putting a ton of pressure on yourself to like try to go earn a business degree or certificate or something, because a lot of this, once you're reading it and learning it, it just makes sense. And so your common sense and your thinking skills will take you a really long way with this stuff. It's probably been about 15 minutes, hasn't it?
Yeah,
okay. Let's see. Oh, just one quick factoid that I learned from a free website. This is really important for you. In North Carolina, you can work for yourself as a sole proprietor without filling out special paperwork. So in other words, to start working with clients and making money, you don't have to first like register or get a license or anything like that. I mean, you can eventually decide to incorporate into an LLC, a limited liability corporation, but you don't have to do that right away. It's not like that in every state, so that's a good thing for you to know. Don't take my word for it, because I'm not, you know, I should not be giving legal advice, but look that up and kind of look at those kinds of regulations and see what might apply to you. The fourth point is to involve other people in your business development process. For me, this has been, you know, my husband has been super supportive and accommodating of my crazy work hours. Another way to involve people is to make a public commitment to your business. And for me, this meant building a website and sharing it with people. So once I decided to, you know, pay for the domain hosting for a year and pour hours and hours of time into building a website, I was committed. This is what I was going to do. Once I shared that website with other people, I was even more committed, because now other people knew I was going to do it. So I couldn't just decide one day not to do it anymore, because that would be embarrassing. So anyway, all that to say, involving other people is a crucial way to commit to others and to yourself that you're going to make it work. And I think a business is something that requires a total commitment for it to succeed. So I've shared a little of my story about what I've learned. I want to quickly talk about the transferability of the humanities PhD stuff, and then we'll open for questions. So I'm going to just describe a process that might sound very familiar to you. First, you get a hunch about a problem that needs to be solved. Then you locate and sift through massive amounts of data, assessing its soundness and its relevance to the question you started with. Then you refine your question in light of what you've learned. After that, you return to the data and you read and analyze and sift some more. Eventually, after long toil, you have a sense that you have solved the problem, you have something new to say, so you communicate your solution to others by writing it down in clear and persuasive prose. So the process I just described is academic research, but it's also the process of developing a business. The processes are pretty much just about identical in terms of like the kind of intellectual work that you're doing. It's just different content that you're thinking about. And to be honest with you, I had more fun developing my business than writing my dissertation. so it's something to look forward to. Both processes, the academic research and the business development, begin with identifying an unmet need, and that here's where your creativity comes in and your independence of thought. Both kinds of work require lots of information gathering, sifting, and arranging, which is where your research skills and your analysis and your synthesis come in. Both processes require boldness in declaring that you have found the answer, which is intellectual confidence, which you had to at least pretend to have. You have to at least pretend to have when you deliver a conference paper or send something off for publication. And finally, both processes require clear communication of a problem and a solution. And I'm sure you guys are all awesome writers or speakers or communicators, or at least you've had tons of practice at it. And all of those skills are obviously going to be really crucial if and when you start a business. So I just want to emphasize in closing that I genuinely believe that small business entrepreneurship is a promising solution to the jobs crisis, at least a partial one. Rather than all of us scrambling and beating each other out of the way for the few jobs that are there, we can skip that process entirely and find unmet needs that we are qualified and positioned to meet. And if even just half of us in this room created our own jobs based on our own unique skills, and maybe even created one more job, hired one person and created one job in which that person can thrive, think about what that would mean for the job market. So it's pretty exciting to think about. And now that's pretty much what I had prepared in terms of remarks, but I'm more than happy to address any questions you all might have.
Great. Well, let me give you an initial round of applause. Thank you. I wanted to start, and please just raise your hand as you have questions. I wanted to just start by asking you about how to what degree are you having to build and construct a new network? I think that's what feels daunting to me sometimes about thinking about what it would be to start a new business. I've invested so much in trying to create an academic network that's related to my own research interests and my own discipline. Have you been able to draw on your old network in kind of surprising ways?
That's a really great question. For me, I already felt like my network was completely like that because I moved. Mm-hmm. So I was already starting over. That's a really good question. I think what would be crucial for anyone is to find a way of networking that you enjoy, mm-hmm. That feels authentic to you. And then just letting it happen over time. And keeping track of the people that you've met, too. Because really, let's say I've had 10 meetings with interesting contacts in the last 6 months. I'm not going to, in terms of time investment, I might meet for coffee, for 1 hour. And then we exchange emails once every month or two indefinitely. So each individual contact doesn't have to be enormously time-consuming. And hopefully the people that you're spending the most time with and most drawn to are people that you enjoy. So for me personally, networking is the really fun part. If that's not the fun part for you, there are resources. I'm really not the best person to answer this because I'm more of an extrovert and I'm like, yeah, bring on the networking. And I know there are people who are like, give me an article about networking for introverts. So there are articles out there for that. That is a thing. Are you all familiar with Jennifer Polk of Ph.D. to Life? I'm pretty sure she is one who has written a piece on networking for introverts. Anyway, it's out there. Google that phrase.
Do you find that most of your contacts, your clients, are from your local, your city you live in, or does it come from everywhere? And if so, what are the differences in finding? Obviously, it's probably easier to find someone who's local, but do you get a lot of people from outside? And if so, how do you find that?
It's funny because when I started my business, it really grew out of being in the research triangle. That was the need I felt. There's researchers all around me who need help communicating or whatever. So initially, all my clients were local. By now, most of my clients aren't local. Most of them, I work with people in London and Singapore because the miracle of Skype. And having that website is crucial because it draws people. People find me that way. And was your question about networking? Wait.
Sure, yeah, the differences between, there's one thing you can, or there's one strategy in local networking, mm-hmm. going down to the coffee shop, building word of mouth, people you already know, but is there some sort of thing you learned about building more global networks, or did that just come organically?
That's a great question. Really, email is key for that. Mm-hmm. And so it's really important to develop email skills. I know that you all know how to write emails, but there are certain kinds of emails that you write to certain kinds of super busy people. So I've been lucky enough to be able to have really fruitful email correspondences with people by writing emails in such a way that would draw that person's interest to read it and respond to my question and say, I know that's a really vague answer. The short answer is you can absolutely network with people far away. but it requires really, really judicious use of email.
Mm-hmm.
Because as soon as your email is a little too long, or they can't quite tell what it's about, or you don't have a good subject line, or you haven't bolded the important phrases, they're not going to read it.
Right.
And I can empathize with that now, because now I'm at the point where I get more emails than I can respond to. So it's the ones that I can see what the person's asking me for. Those are the ones I respond to.
So dense, chewy academic passages are not
No.
recommended for.
No,
What's the
people use phrases like action items and deliverables, and you don't have to do that if you don't want to. But I would say if you are a really dense academic writer, have a non-academic friend read your emails and critique them for you, and work on that skill. It's going to be really crucial, and even really for local, not just for people abroad, but even local networking.
Yeah, Harrison, and then, yeah.
I wondered if you could elaborate on a part of your narrative that seems to be the most crucial, and that was how you got started, because you kind of phrase it like editing just appeared at your door, but I can say 7 years into my PhD, editing has never appeared at my door.
Oh,
So I'm wondering, like, what was it something you did in your program that opened this up to you? Was it something you actively pursued? I'm wondering about like the actual.
That's a really good question, and it was super condensed. So my PhD is in English, and I taught writing, I taught literature, so I already had that. I was known as a good writer in my graduate program, and people knew I was home with a baby and needed stuff to do. So those initial projects that came through word of mouth were all from, graduate school contacts and friends. And then it wasn't until I really decided I'm going to start a business and I'm going to develop this way of doing it that I kind of actively pursued or cultivated the kinds of project I really wanted to do.
Do you think you would have considered this? Like, I mean, was it just kind of like serendipity that these were circumstances that came together that made this happen, or was this something that you kind of thought about or?
Specifically, a writing support business,
Yeah.
or just, that in a longer version of this, I talked about how, as I look back, I can see moments when this was foreshadowed, but I was never aware of it at the time. Like, if you had told me 4 years ago that I would start a business, I'd be like, what? Ugh, But I look back and I see all this evidence that that's what I was moving toward. And so I've always had this entrepreneurial spirit. And I don't know if it's maybe I just didn't have as good of self-knowledge as I thought, or maybe an entrepreneurial spirit is something that can lie completely dormant in you until the moment. And the moment in my life came when it just sprung out and was it completely changed. And really the crucial period for that was I was talking to our other speaker. It was when I was home with my baby. And the house was quiet, it's just me and no adults to talk to, listening to 7 hours worth of podcasts every day. It suddenly, I ran out of podcasts, so I started listening to Planet Money. Oh, I guess I'll listen to the Money one. Ugh. And then that got really interesting. I was like, wait a minute, that is interesting. And then you have things like, well, I want to be able to send my kid to a good school, so suddenly I cared about money. I mean, sorry, I know that's terrible to say, but... And you have to be that way if you're working for yourself, because no one is giving you a salary. So you have to be just frank and accepting of the fact that you are working for pay. I hope that answers your question.
Harrison first, and then, yeah.
Could you talk about success and failure in academia versus in the business world, entrepreneurship world? Like failure at grad school, it's not getting a paper in a conference or a journal, or not getting a tenure-track job or something. But if you fail in the business world, you don't eat.
That's a really good question. So just to be very candid, my husband's a social worker, so it's not like we're living high on the hog. But we trimmed our budget to the point where we needed what I earned, but it wasn't like we'd be out on the street. So that's helpful. If I were a single person, it would have been different. I would have lived probably in a teeny studio, So you've got to consider your own financial situation. How far back can you trim everything? How long, plan to live for a while without making any money, so that whatever you make is great, we can buy the $6 bottle of wine instead of the $5 bottle of wine. But, yeah. Sorry, those painkillers. I'm blaming the painkillers.
Right, Anna?
It seems like a lot of the sort of success stories of people moving on, and I absolutely think you're success stories, so congratulations, it sounds like you're doing great, are moving into this realm where they're providing service for other academics or for other people engaged in these kind of intellectual production endeavors. So I guess the first question is that what you see your business doing, is are academics your primary audience? And then, do you see a point at which we're going to hit some kind of market saturation? Like, we can't all go out and do what you're doing, presumably. But it seems like what you're doing, what the sort of Professor is in services are doing, they're marketing to this academic clientele. So, I mean, is that just a low-hanging fruit that's out there? Not that I'm accusing you of just taking the easy route, but where else do we go?
That's a really, really great question. And okay, so the market saturation thing, I mean, that's a concern because, okay, so one thing I'll say about that, and I'm going to come back to your question about success versus failure because I remembered it and I wrote it down. Sorry. You guys might have to occasionally remind me what I was talking about. I'm so sorry. Okay, so primary market saturation. Okay, so there's sort of this principle in business that whoever's there first is like the legacy person. So they have this extreme advantage over anyone who would try to come in. A newcomer would have to come in and be exceptionally exceptional to dislodge. But there's, I mean, how many academic support services do we need? And obviously we don't want to just, we're not solving the problem if we keep funneling everyone, okay, we'll funnel you away from academic jobs to self-employed academic support. Like, that's obviously not the main solution. So one, I'm really, really fascinated by this, and I'm really watching this to see what other kinds of business people are developing and how many different potential routes there are. And even with ScholarShape, you know, just to be, again, candid, I don't anticipate that ScholarShape will always look like this. I anticipate there will be a moment in time where my service offerings shift because the marketplace is always shifting. And that's part of what it means to have a business. You know, it's like all the old stories you hear about, like the company that manufactured horsewhips didn't adequately adapt, and when everyone switched to cars, they were out of business. It's like, well, you should have seen the cars coming and adapted accordingly. Like, you really have to have that adaptability to succeed over the long term. And that really gets back to the question about success versus failure, because I think what I love about, you know, entrepreneurship is that there's not a definite success or failure. It's like, oh, well, that didn't go right. Let me try this other thing. You know, you just kind of pivot. As opposed to academia, things felt a little more absolute to me. Like, if you don't make this deadline, that's it. And, you know, I do better with, like, looser, self-created structure than with imposed structure. And that's a temperamental thing. I know that doesn't necessarily suit everyone. But in terms of other types of businesses, everything I do with ScholarShape really is transferable. I mean, yes, I have this expert, quote-unquote, knowledge of academic genres, but that could all be displaced onto scientists trying to communicate about their emerging technologies with potential investors. You know, essentially I help people communicate. That's what the bottom line is. And I do that in a way that is totally customized to the individual, to who they are, to their project, to their timeline. So if or when the time comes that this doesn't feel as needed, I will pivot to something else. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. So I had a question. I was wondering, I mean, certainly not all of us have a spouse with an income to rely on.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, how realistic do you think this auction is for people who are looking at complete unemployment currently, and, you know, the burden of paying for health insurance, self-employment tax, startup costs, you know, your domain name, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, is like Kickstarter the only way to go? I don't even know if there are like financial resources out there. I mean,
that's a really great question. So
like
I know that there are small business loans, especially for women. And I do know, like, I could have supported myself. I just couldn't support all three of us. So I say that, what I mean is, you know, if this is the path you commit to, and you completely pour yourself into it, and you really trim your budget, you can make it work. At least it can be done. Startup costs, there are lots of ways to keep those really minimal. I think I spent $97 on my business for the first 2 years, or year. It was $97 a year for the hosting of my website, and that includes the domain name. And then, other than that, Skype is free, email is free, talking on the phone is free. I mean, I have to have a cell phone. But there's no overhead with a knowledge-based service business. So one way to, and I don't know what kind of business you're thinking of, but there are ways to just get work coming in quickly. If you're willing to work, if your approach is going to be, let me just get some work to make some money, I don't really necessarily totally care what it is, then you can go with there are certain organizations that will, get on the list. For editing, you can get on publishers' lists of copy editors, that kind of thing. And it's hard to answer this question in general terms because everyone's situation is so different. But I will say that it was a lot more doable than I thought it would be. Because really within about 8 months of launching the business, it was full-time. I had enough work to fill a full-time schedule.
Just a quick follow-up question. Did you do a business plan or anything like that?
That's a good question. So there's what I would suggest. There's this thing called the lean startup model, or the lean business plan. It's great. I can send you guys, if you guys want to email me, I can put together a whole list of resources to send you. One of them is this one-page lean business plan template, and it's literally fits on a piece of computer paper, and it's got all these little boxes. And so it's it's a skeletal kind of improvisational way to start a business, and then you can fill it in and refine it over time. A traditional business plan is 10 billion pages long. I never did that. Well, I started to, but then I spilled chocolate milk on my computer because my life was insane and I couldn't get it, so then I'm like, eh. Eventually I just did the one-page thing on my new computer.
So your website has a really nice design and it looks great, and I can see why someone would go to your website and think, oh, this is a very professional looking service. Did it start off exactly like this, and did you make all of it?
I made it, but I relentlessly sought feedback from everyone. I mean, you should have seen the early versions. It was terrible. I knew nothing about anything. But okay, so this, I don't remember if I said this here. Building a website is going to be important, whether you do it yourself or hire someone. If you're going to do it yourself, it pays to look at a few of the different platforms and figure out which one makes sense to you intuitively. For me, I looked at WordPress and I'm like, ugh, and I looked at Wix, I'm like, ugh, and Weebly, ugh. But then I found Squarespace and I was like, this is perfect. And I think NPR probably brainwashed me to go with Squarespace because I mentioned that I listened to about 7 hours of podcasts a day while I was taking care of my newborn son, and it's almost like it was conditioning me to start a business. I love Squarespace. I have found it really intuitive. There's a really helpful forum. You can ask questions or find other people who've asked your question. So I was able to build it. I was able to make the graphics using software called Canva, also free, web-based graphic design. I did not spend a penny on that website except the $97 a year to host it. I'm lucky enough that my husband has a good eye. So I could be like, what's wrong with this? And he could be like, oh, that font should be a little bit larger. Oh, you're using 3 different fonts here, just use one of them. That kind of thing. So it'd be great if you can find someone in your life who has an eye like that, who'd be willing, because it only takes them 10 seconds, but it saves you 5 hours of figuring out what's wrong with it. And this goes back to what I was saying about resources you already have. I think it's helpful to think about how much is already right there within arm's reach and going with that. If I didn't have anyone in my life with a great eye, there would be something else in my life that was great, that was a resource, and then that would become an asset to ScholarShape. So just, working with what you have is really the thing to do.
In the back there.
I wonder if you've maintained relationships with your former academic friends, advisors, and those kind of people, and how do they react to the fact that you've done a business instead of an academic career? And to add on to that, do you think it's possible to do both?
Okay, so first, how have they reacted? Deafening silence for the most part. My 2 best friends are still my friends, but I don't get emails back from people. But that's fine. You know, I really am happy. This is the right path for me, and I'm happy with it. And everything's a trade-off. The other question about doing both, it's hard for me to imagine how that would be possible. I'm not saying it's not possible. I'm a pretty single-minded person, so for me, if I'm going to do something, it's like all in, you know. And I think that's why my business took off relatively quickly. Like, there are people who say it takes 2 to 5 years to get a business off the ground. And mine was, I was working full-time within 8 months. And that's not always a good thing because I'm a little obsessive. I mentioned I had surgery 2 days ago, but I was not missing this. So, you know. But I would be very interested. This is something I'm looking for. I'm keeping my eyes peeled for people who are able to do both, because I've gotten this question before and I never know how to answer it. Especially because having a business, a knowledge service-based business means you are the brand, like you are the center of it. So at least I can't think of a way to really do that and draw in clients without being out there about the fact that you're doing it. So it's not like you can kind of do it in secret, at least not that I'm aware of. And I think of it as something that requires a pretty large commitment. So hopefully that helps.
I was just going to ask about building a brand. Is there some way you could imagine building your brand where you still maintain your scholarly identity? Like, would that be a way to promote services of a certain kind?
Me specifically or in general?
Well, I'm thinking like for this kind of editing and the kind of work you're describing, like would continuing to publish promote that you can write well and think well and do all of that, or do you think that's just not necessary?
Well, one reason I really settled on working with just scholars is because I do still feel like or consider myself to be something of an academic. I didn't want to give that up entirely as an identity. So I sort of exist on the margins. And I do have projects. I do have like half done or 2/3 done papers I would love to publish. The challenge is time, because if you're not getting paid for something and you do need to make a living, you know, then it becomes a hobby. And when you have a 2-year-old, it's like, you know, that's just, it's really hard to do. But I do think that there could be a time when I could work it in.
You go.
I guess I just wonder about how much we're trained to do solitary pursuits as humanities PhDs, and I thought your answer was really interesting of, oh, well, you have to build your own personal brand, and it takes so long to have a single-minded pursuit, and I'm just wondering, you know, are there ways in which we're thinking about how to restructure our job opportunities? Are there ways to have consulting businesses on knowledge-based skill sets where we hire each other, and then we're still able to teach, we're still able to write together and create kind of new networks of scholars and new networks of producing scholarship?
So the question was, I'm sorry, can you repeat?
So how do you envision, your answer has been very solitary.
Oh, okay.
Of, this is how you build your brand, and this is how you build to have this like place in the market. And so, you know, how do we think beyond the solitary model?
Like a sort of collective?
Yeah.
Well, I love this question because a good friend of mine is also you might know her, Heidi Justo. Okay, and she's awesome. She's like one of my best friends. And we talk about, we need a PhD entrepreneur group in this area. There are enough of us, and like you said, like a lot of this is solitary, let's bring it together, you know? And just in our relationship, we've really benefited from the exchange of ideas and the camaraderie and, you know, the 2 a.m. texting, you know, oh, still trying to finish this, you know. It's really good to have that, because that was the number one thing I missed when grad school ended. I shared a TA office with 16 other people, and it was so great. So there are absolutely ways to reproduce, to build that camaraderie into this career path. And I think this is the perfect place in the world to do that. So keep in touch.
Yeah.
Be in my group.
Yeah.
Ashley? And
Yeah. Earlier you mentioned that one of the strategies for bringing in work is to get on the publishers' copy edit list. Is that something that you?
I've never done that, but the way this became an idea to me was I was just talking with someone socially who works for Duke Press, and I've been thinking about hiring people to help me, but how do you, anyway, I was asking him, how do you manage all that copy editing for all of those articles, and how closely do you have to check their work, and blah, blah, blah. And he said when he came into the job, he inherited a list of freelance copy editors. And generally, certain kinds of projects went to certain editors, but basically they had their list. And so I thought, oh, that would be a good way for someone starting out to get on a list. And you're going to make less than you would working for yourself, but it would be more steady, probably. So what I would suggest, if you're thinking of that route, I would suggest go to the Editorial Freelancers Association website and kind of poke around on there and explore what they say about, a lot of people who are members of that organization get their business in that kind of way, like they're on lists somewhere, whether it's with a mainstream publisher or scholarly publisher or whatever. And the second thing I would say is build relationships with whoever is working in these presses, who knows where that list is, who can get you on that list. I think a lot of the publishers pay by the word, and I think it probably works out to maybe $20 or $25 an hour. So it's definitely a good start.
Claire?
Thanks, Susan. This may be something that you addressed early in your talk. I arrived a few minutes late. Could you speak a little bit about the sort of the politics of the personal choices that you made? Like, did you find that the alt-act path was more welcoming to you at the moment in your life that you were in with a family, or had you already chosen to sort of step off the academic job track when you decided to start your business, or did you find that, like, in that moment in your life, that was really the option for you?
It was really like everything happened all at once in my life that made an academic job look impossible, and it really felt like my only option, or the inevitable option, or like it was very clear to me that the right thing to do was start a business, like whole hog, or if that's even an expression. And I don't know if you were here for the part where I said, like, all at once during my job season, I moved across the country, finished grad school, had a baby, my husband started his new job. So it was just like, I was like in labor when one of the applications was due for one of the jobs. It was just not going to happen. And I wasn't going to sit around for a year and apply again. I just couldn't. I couldn't sit and wait. I had to do something else. So, and then I guess, probably part of me was thinking, let me just do it now, and we'll see how I feel when the job market comes around. By the time the new job season came around, the business had already taken off, and I was loving it. So I didn't feel any desire to apply to other academic jobs.
Yeah, Harrison?
Quick question. You mentioned you've read a bunch of books about starting a business. What's one you would recommend?
Oh, okay. Well, some of them aren't explicitly business books. They're like self-knowledge. It turns out I really like self-help books. But so my dissertation is on Herman Melville. So it's like going from this incredibly dense 10 million page philosophical tomes to like breezy, it was really fun. So one that I like, it's shelved with the business books, but I think it's just a self-knowledge book. It's called Now Discover Your Strengths by Cunningham, I think. Anyway, amazing book for helping you think conceptually about what you're really good at. And then once you have these ways of thinking, this language to talk about what you're really good at, you can see how it transfers across domains. Other books, another really great book, if you're thinking the consulting route, there's a book called The Insider's Guide to Building a Successful Consulting Practice by Bruce Katcher, Katcher. Really comprehensive. It's only like maybe 150 or 200 pages, but it's like the Bible for this. Like, it really walks you through every aspect from the beginning through to the point in the last chapter where you have to figure out how to raise your rates, because you're so busy. So it's really good. And then another one that was good was The Secrets to Word of Mouth Marketing. I mean, just, you'll figure it out. You'll go to I went to the Southwest branch of the library. That's where the good baby story time was. And they had, they've got a whole aisle. And so you just kind of flip through and see which ones draw you. A lot of people like Seth Godin, and he really irritates me. So you might like him. He's just too much, The consulting guy, Bruce Katcher, he is a Ph.D., so he's a little, sorry, I don't mean to look down at people without a Ph.D., but he writes with a real sense of like seriousness and gravitas that I appreciate a lot.
Anybody else? Yeah, Sarah.
If you're moving from a place where you're doing, do you see it possible to work from a place where you're doing part-time consulting work while in graduate school and then transitioning to full-time work? Do you see that being a feasible route?
I think so. I mean, I guess it would depend on your field, your network, what services you want to offer, how you define the services, and whether you can make it all fit into your life. I don't see any reason in theory why that wouldn't work, and I think it's great to have some, when you're starting off, it can be great to have your business not be everything and have that much pressure on it. So do as I say, not as I do.
Well, I'd like to just thank you again, Margy, for this. I really appreciate it.